Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolute geopolitical earthquake, the 2026 US-Iran war. We are going to take a deep, structured dive into the origins, the dramatic outbreak, and the honestly mind-blowing aftermath of this entire conflict. Because what's truly fascinating about this story is how a massive military confrontation, one literally designed to reshape the region by force, ironically ended up uniting historic Middle Eastern rivals in a frantic push for peace.
Just think about this quote for a second. We're probably seeing the final days of American empire in the Middle East. That bold assertion from Andreas Krieg at King's College London perfectly frames the central paradox we're about to explore today. A war meant to assert dominance instead acted like a giant reset button, catalyzing a complete reimagining of regional alliances.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We'll be looking at the road to war, the 2026 outbreak, retaliation and spillover, choking the global economy, and finally, that unexpected push for peace.
Starting off with Section 1, the road to war. Decades of simmering tension finally boil over into direct conflict.
It's honestly staggering how fast this whole thing snowballed. I mean, this definitely didn't happen in a vacuum. In June of 2025, we saw the 12-day war, which included U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. By December, crushing sanctions led to a severe economic crisis and a major currency plunge, which sparked massive nationwide protests across Iran. All this domestic instability and extreme geopolitical friction led directly to a huge U.S. military buildup in January 2026. The stage was officially set.
To really wrap our heads around the immense pressure the Iranian government was under right before the war broke out, we have to look at this devastating number: 12,000. That's the estimated casualty count from the government crackdown on those 2025 and 2026 protests. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually called the currency collapse that triggered all of this the grand culmination of U.S. sanctions. The internal human cost was just staggering, and it created an incredibly volatile environment.
That brings us right into Section 2, the 2026 outbreak, Operation Epic Fury, and the explicit push for regime change. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive wave of joint airstrikes. We're talking strikes hitting critical military and government sites across major Iranian cities: Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah. But the real shockwave, the most monumental event of this initial attack, was the assassination of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in a strike on his compound. The U.S. administration's stated aims were completely uncompromising here: destroy Iran's missile program and forcefully bring about regime change.
Moving on to Section 3, retaliation and spillover. A multi-front war engulfs the region.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how fast the inferno spread, because it definitely could not be contained. This wasn't just some localized border clash. Look at the geographic scale. Iran launched a drone strike all the way out on a UK base in Cyprus. They targeted critical energy infrastructure in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, including the Aramco refinery. They fired hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles straight at Israel, all while keeping up a steady drumbeat of attacks on U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria.
But while the main war is raging, proxy conflicts are absolutely exploding. 1.2 million. That is the massive number of people displaced in Lebanon as the Israel-Hezbollah conflict escalated into the brutal 2026 Lebanon war, which saw a resumption of major ground combat and airstrikes. So the humanitarian cost radiating outward from the primary conflict was frankly immense.
Which leads us to Section 4, choking the global economy, the battle for the Strait of Hormuz.
So, what does this actually mean for the rest of the world? Well, the battlefield quickly expanded from military targets to global trade choke points. The immediate threat to global stability became the Strait of Hormuz blockade. Iran effectively closed this absolutely vital oil and gas route to deter maritime pressure and counter a severe U.S. naval blockade of their own ports. When the Strait of Hormuz gets choked off like that, global supply chains panic, energy markets skyrocket, and inflation hits everyone's wallet hard.
It basically triggered this rapid-fire sequence of economic warfare. First, Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Second, the U.S. initiates a strict naval blockade on Iranian ports to raise the economic cost on Tehran. And third, global energy markets are suddenly under immense pressure. Now, the U.S. did try to launch a maritime initiative called Project Freedom to guide commercial vessels through, but they had to pause it almost immediately to facilitate negotiations. The economic strain on U.S. allies in the Gulf, countries that rely entirely on those shipping lanes staying open, was just becoming completely unbearable. Which brings us to the wildest twist in this whole story. Section 5. An unexpected push for peace. Middle Eastern rivals unite.
So the crucial point here is this massive split in priorities. On one hand, you have the US and Israel, whose goals were regime change and the total destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities. But on the other hand, the Gulf states, who remember are traditional adversaries of Iran, had a very different goal. They realized that a total state collapse right next door in Iran would unleash absolute, unimaginable chaos across their own borders. So their primary objective quickly shifted to just maintaining regional stability and desperately pushing for peace.
And that fear actually led to the Islamabad Accords on April 8th. But here's the crazy part. This fragile ceasefire wasn't mediated by Washington or by European powers. It was mediated by Pakistan and Qatar. Regional powers looked at the existential threat to their economies and their own security, and they basically took the diplomatic reins themselves to de-escalate the crisis.
Naturally, the diplomatic fallout in Washington was intense. The Times of Israel summed it up perfectly, reporting, Israel began the Iran war as a partner of the U.S. and is ending it on the sidelines. What happened was an unprecedented coalition of Muslim-majority nations successfully lobbied the U.S. administration to accept a tentative peace deal. They effectively outweighed the fierce opposition from Israeli leadership who wanted to keep the military campaign going.
So how does it all shake out? Ultimately, this conflict completely rewrote the security architecture of the Middle East. Right now, we're seeing the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan actively aligning to manage their own regional security. There's a very clear, marked decrease in their reliance on the traditional U.S. defense umbrella. We're even seeing serious discussions about a mutual defense pact, which some folks are already dubbing a Muslim NATO. Because the U.S. couldn't land a total knockout blow on Tehran, Iran's neighbors decided they simply had to find a pragmatic accommodation if they wanted to survive.
Which leaves us with this huge, lingering question. With the Middle East now actively building its own security consensus and shifting away from U.S. reliance, what exactly is the future of American power in the region? The 2026 U.S.-Iran war was meant to cement dominance once and for all. But as you've seen, it may have just accelerated the rise of a truly multipolar Middle East.